Imagine your whole life, you've pictured Noah's Ark as a long wooden boat with a pointed bow. That image is in every child's Bible, every painting, every movie. Now imagine discovering that the original flood story, written on clay 1,000 years before Genesis, describes something completely different. A round boat, a giant circular coracle, 120 feet across, coiled from rope and sealed with tar. Same animals, same 2 by 2, same survival, completely different shape. Everything you were taught was original. Isn't. The story everyone assumes starts in one place. Ask most people where the flood story comes from and they will say Genesis, Noah, the Ark, 40 days and 40 nights. It feels ancient because it is ancient. But ancient is a relative word, and in Mesopotamia, relative gets complicated fast. The oldest surviving fragments of the biblical flood narrative as part of the text of Genesis are generally dated by scholars to sometime in the 1st millennium BCE, with most placing the written compilation somewhere around the 6th or 7th century BCE, during or after the Babylonian exile. That is already a long time ago by any normal measure. It is not, however, the oldest flood story in the region. Not close. Go back further, into a civilization most people can barely place on a map, and the story already exists. Sumer, southern Mesopotamia, the stretch of land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now Iraq. This was one of the very first literate civilizations on Earth, developing writing, itself cuneiform, pressed with a reed stylus into wet clay, sometime in the late 4th millennium BCE, long before Rome, long before Greece, long before the pyramids at Giza were finished. Sumerian scribes were already recording laws, receipts, poetry, and myths onto tablets that would outlast almost everything built above ground in the same period. Clay, it turns out, survives fire and flood far better than wood, papyrus, or memory. And buried in that clay was a flood story of their own, older than anything in the Hebrew Bible by, on conservative estimates, close to 1,000 years, and on some datings, considerably more. This is where the story usually gets told badly. People hear that an older flood myth exists and jump straight to a scandal, straight to accusations that the Bible copied Sumerian mythology wholesale, case closed. That is not honest, and it is not what the actual evidence supports. The relationship between these texts is more interesting than a simple copy-paste, and more unsettling in its own way, because what survives is not one Sumerian flood story. It is several, layered across centuries, each version reshaping the last, converging eventually into the version most people think is uniquely biblical, the king list problem. Before you even get to a flood narrative, there is a strange document called the Sumerian king list, a text that records the succession of kings believed to have ruled the region going back to the very beginning of kingship itself. Multiple versions of this list survive on different tablets, copied and updated by scribes over centuries, and near the top, before the list moves into names that overlap with historically attested rulers, there is a flood. The text states plainly that kingship existed before the flood in 5 cities held by 8 kings, reigning for periods so long they stretch into the tens of thousands of years by the text's own count. Then, in the list's own words, the flood swept over the land. After the flood, the list says, kingship again descended from heaven, and it resumes in a different city. Scholars generally treat those pre-flood reign lengths as symbolic or mythologized rather than literal history, and that caution is worth stating plainly. Nobody credible is arguing a king reigned for tens of thousands of years. What is worth sitting with is the structural detail. And the alphabet after so absolute that it interrupts the very succession of kings. That is not a small mythological flourish. That is a civilization organizing its entire sense of time around a single catastrophic flood, the same basic function the flood plays in Genesis, dividing the antediluvian world from everything that comes after, the Eridu Genesis. The oldest known Sumerian flood narrative that actually tells a story, rather than just referencing an event, is a fragmentary text scholar now generally called the Eridu Genesis, sometimes referred to by its Sumerian title tied to the god Zeus Sudra. Surviving copies date to around the early 2nd millennium BCE, though scholars broadly agree the oral tradition behind it is considerably older. The tablet is damaged badly enough that entire sections are missing, which is its own kind of frustration. You can feel a full story sitting just behind the broken clay, and you cannot always get to it. What survives describes a king named Ziusudra, described in the text as pious and God-fearing, who receives a warning. The gods in council have decided to destroy humanity with a flood. One god, Enki, breaks the divine secrecy and warns Ziusudra, instructing him to build a great boat. The surviving fragments describe a flood of catastrophic scale, sweeping the land for what the text describes as 7 days and 7 nights, after which Ziusudra opens a window in his vessel and the sun god Utu shines light into the boat. Ziusudra then makes offerings, an ox and a sheep, in gratitude, and is ultimately granted. A form of immortality by the gods for his piety, sent to live in a distant land called Dilmun. If any part of that sounds structurally familiar, that is the entire point. A righteous man, divinely warned, builds a boat, survives a catastrophic flood of the world, and afterward offers sacrifice in gratitude. That is the exact narrative skeleton later Genesis follows with Noah. Not identical in every detail, not the same names, not the same theology behind the flood's cause, but structurally, unmistakably, the same story architecture. Before we go further into the tablet that turned this from myth into blueprint, this is a good place to hit subscribe, because the next section is the part almost nobody outside of specialist circles has actually seen, and it is the reason this story is being talked about again after decades of sitting quietly in a museum archive. Atrahasis, and the reason for the flood. The Eridu Genesis is not the only, or even the most detailed, Sumerian and Akkadian flood account. A separate and more complete text, known as the Epic of Atrahasis, composed in Akkadian, the language that eventually succeeded Sumerian as the dominant tongue of Mesopotamia, gives a fuller picture, and one of the surviving copies is dated to around the 17th century BCE, making it by itself already thoroughly older than the Genesis flood text as a written document. What makes Atrahasis genuinely strange is not the flood. It is the reason given for the flood. In this account, humanity is not destroyed for wickedness, for violence, for moral corruption, the reasons Genesis gives. Humanity is destroyed because human beings have become too numerous, and their noise, their sheer collective clamor, is disturbing the God Enlil's sleep. It is a startlingly petty motive by later religious standards, and that is exactly why many scholars find it so compelling as an early layer of the tradition. It reads like an older, rawer version of a story that later gets moralized, cleaned up, and given a more theologically satisfying justification as it passes through different cultures and centuries. In Atrahasis, the hero, named Atrahasis, meaning roughly the exceedingly wise one, is again warned by the god Enki, again instructed to build a boat, again survives a flood that wipes out the rest of humanity. The tablet that changed everything. All of this, the king list, the Eridu Genesis, Atrahasis, was already known to scholars for well over a century. What changed, and what makes this story worth telling right now, rather than 50 years ago, is a single tablet that sat essentially unread in a private collection for decades before finally being properly translated in the early 2010s by Irving Finkel, a senior curator of Mesopotamian written culture at the British Museum, one of the small number of people alive who can read cuneiform fluently at a research level. The tablet, which Finkel and others refer to as the Ark Tablet, had been brought to him by a private collector whose father had acquired it decades earlier, reportedly in the Middle East in the years following the Second World War, without full documentation of exactly where it had originally been excavated, a detail that matters for archaeological context but does not undermine the authenticity of the tablet itself, which Finkel and the British Museum have treated as genuine cuneiform of the Old Babylonian period, likely dating to somewhere around 1750 BCE, based on the script style and content. What is written on it is a version of the Atrahasis flood narrative, but with a level of practical, technical detail that no other surviving flood tablet provides. This is not a poetic retelling. It is closer to an instruction manual. The god Enki, speaking directly to the flood hero in the text, gives him precise measurements for the boat he needs to build. And here is where it gets genuinely strange enough that it appended what most people, including most biblical scholars, had always pictured when they imagined this story. The boat is not shaped like the ark most people grew up picturing, a long rectangular vessel with a pointed bow, the shape found in countless children's Bibles and museum dioramas. According to the tablet, the vessel Etrahasis is instructed to build is round. A giant coracle, a circular boat, a shape that has an extremely long practical history in Mesopotamian riverine culture, where small round boats made of reed and hide were a common and genuinely functional way to move goods and people along rivers for thousands of years. The tablet gives a diameter for this vessel of roughly 120 feet, an enormous circular structure by any standard, built with a coiled rope frame made watertight with a specific quantity of bitumen, the natural tar that was abundant in the region and used throughout Mesopotamian construction. The text specifies quantities of rope, reed bundles, and bitumen with the kind of precision you would expect from an actual construction record, not a piece of religious poetry. The scale of it, once you actually try to picture a circular vessel that size, is difficult to hold in your head. A boat wider across than most modern swimming pools are long, built entirely from coiled rope and reed and sealed with tar, meant to float an entire menagerie of animals through a flood that ends the world. Finkel himself has said publicly that when he first worked through the translation and realized what the tablet was actually describing, his reaction moved quickly from professional caution to genuine astonishment, because nothing in the surviving corpus of Mesopotamian flood texts had ever given construction specifications this exact. And then there is the detail that made headlines when Finkel's work was finally published and made its way into mainstream reporting. The tablet instructs that the animals should be brought onto the boat 2 by 2, not by elaborate categories of clean and unclean animals in different numbers, the more complex system that appears in parts of the Genesis text, but the simpler, more universally remembered detail, 2 by 2, appearing here on a tablet written well over 1,000 years before the book of Genesis reached the form in which we have it today. It is worth being precise about what that similarity does and does not prove, because this is exactly the point where a lot of online discussion goes further than the evidence actually supports. It does not prove the biblical authors read this specific tablet. It almost certainly did not happen that directly. What it does establish, and this part is not in serious dispute among historians of the ancient Near East, is that the core narrative architecture of the flood story, a righteous man warned by a god, instructed to build a specific vessel, boarding paired animals, surviving a flood that ends a corrupt world, existed in written form in Mesopotamia for well over a millennium before Genesis, and that this narrative tradition was widely enough known across the ancient Near East that it is functionally impossible for later Hebrew scribes, living for a time under Babylonian influence and later exile, to have been unaware of it. The easy answers and why they don't quite hold. Whenever this story gets discussed, two tidy explanations tend to get offered immediately, and both deserve a fair hearing before being set aside. The first is coincidence, the idea that flood myths are common worldwide simply because floods themselves are common, a universal human experience that different cultures independently mythologized in broadly similar ways. There is real truth buried in this explanation. Flood narratives do appear across a striking number of unrelated cultures, from Mesoamerica to ancient China to numerous flood traditions across the world, and large-scale flooding was and remains a genuine catastrophic threat to river-valley civilizations in particular, which is exactly the kind of environment Sumer occupied. But coincidence struggles to explain the specificity of the overlap here. Independent cultures separated by geography tend to produce flood myths that diverge sharply in structural detail, different causes, different heroes, different resolutions. The level of matching structure between the Mesopotamian and biblical flood narratives, a single righteous man, divine warning, specific boat-building instructions, paired animals, a period of floating followed by birds sent out to test for dry land, a detail present in both Gilgamesh's later flood account and Genesis, goes well beyond what independent coincidence typically produces. The second explanation is direct, deliberate copying, the idea that Hebrew scribes simply took the Mesopotamian story and rewrote it as their own. This framing tends to be popular precisely because it sounds scandalous, but most serious scholars of comparative Ancient Near Eastern literature treat it as to blunt an explanation for what the textual evidence actually shows. The differences between the traditions are real and theologically significant. The reason given for the flood, humanity's noise disturbing a sleeping god in Atrahasis, versus a moral judgment against human wickedness in Genesis, is not a minor edit. It represents a fundamentally different theology, a different understanding of why disaster happens and what kind of God allows or causes it. A text that was simply copying an older source for convenience does not typically perform that kind of deep theological restructuring. It suggests instead a tradition being deliberately reworked, reinterpreted through a very different religious lens, by people who knew the older story well enough to consciously argue with it. What most scholars land on instead is something in between and honestly more interesting than either extreme. A shared narrative tradition circulating broadly across the ancient Near East for well over 1,000 years, absorbed by successive cultures including the authors and editors of the Hebrew Bible, and reshaped each time to fit the theology and historical moment of whoever was retelling it. Not theft. Not coincidence, inheritance, and reinterpretation. The Gilgamesh connection, and a scholar who nearly missed his own train. There's one more major piece of this puzzle, and it comes with one of the better stories in the history of archaeology. In 1872, a self-taught British Assyriologist named George Smith was working through a large collection of cuneiform tablets recovered decades earlier from the ruins of the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh in what is now northern Iraq. Smith had no formal university training. He had started as an engraver and taught himself cuneiform largely by studying tablets at the British Museum in his spare time, which makes what happened next all the more remarkable. While working through a badly damaged tablet, Tablet 11 of what would come to be known as the Epic of Gilgamesh, Smith realized he was reading a flood narrative embedded inside the larger epic, a story told to Gilgamesh by an immortal flood survivor named Utnapishtim, describing a great flood, a boat, and animals brought aboard to survive it, a story that closely paralleled the biblical account he, like most educated Victorians, already knew well from Sunday readings of Genesis. According to accounts from colleagues at the time, Smith was reportedly so overcome by what he was reading that he began pulling off his clothes in his excitement, a detail that has been repeated often enough in the historical record of the discovery that it has become one of the more colorful anecdotes in the history of Assyriology, whatever the precise details of that afternoon actually looked like. The announcement of Smith's finds, made publicly to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London in December of 1872, caused an immediate sensation, both scholarly and public, precisely because it raised the question this entire video has been circling. If a flood story this similar to Genesis existed on a tablet from a library that predated the Hebrew Bible by centuries, what did that mean for how the biblical account came to exist? That question, asked openly in a lecture hall in 1872, has never fully gone away. It has simply become better documented, better dated, and considerably harder to dismiss, especially now that Finkel's Ark tablet has added construction-level detail that the Gilgamesh account never provided. The wider pattern. Zoom out from Mesopotamia entirely and the picture gets even stranger because flood narratives involving a chosen survivor and a vessel are not confined to the ancient Near East at all. Ancient Greek tradition preserves the story of Deucalion, warned by his father Prometheus of an impending flood sent by Zeus, who builds a chest to survive the deluge alongside his wife. Hindu tradition preserves the story of Manu, warned by a fish, later revealed as a form of the god Vishnu, to build a boat ahead of a great flood. Numerous indigenous traditions across the Americas preserve flood narratives with broadly similar structures: a warned survivor, a vessel, a repopulated world afterward, developed in cultures that had no plausible root of textual contact with Mesopotamia at the time these traditions took shape. None of these should be treated as proof of a single shared historical flood event, and responsible scholarship generally does not make that leap. What they do suggest, taken together, is either a genuinely global human tendency to mythologize catastrophic flooding in similar narrative shapes, or, in the specific case of the ancient Near Eastern texts discussed here, cultures in close and sustained contact drawing from a common, very old, well-traveled story. Why this doesn't get taught? Here is the part of the story that tends to generate the most uncomfortable silence. And it is worth being careful and fair about it, because words like cover-up get thrown around too loosely in stories like this one. Nobody is hiding the Ark Tablet. It is on public display, discussed openly in Finkel's own published book on the subject, and covered by major outlets when the translation was first announced. The information is not secret. But it is also not exactly front and center in how most people encounter the story of Noah, whether in a church setting or a general cultural sense, and the reason for that gap is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. For a significant number of religious communities, treating the flood narrative as one version among several closely related ancient Near Eastern flood traditions, rather than a uniquely revealed and historically singular event, raises real theological questions that many traditions have not fully settled how to answer. That is not a conspiracy. It is the ordinary human discomfort that comes when new evidence complicates a story that has carried enormous religious and cultural weight for thousands of years. Meanwhile, in purely academic circles, the opposite caution applies. Scholars who work carefully in this space tend to resist the more sensational framing this topic often receives online, the idea that the Bible was simply plagiarized, because that framing oversimplifies a genuinely complex process of cultural transmission and reinterpretation stretching across more than 1,000 years and multiple civilizations. So, the careful, nuanced version of the story ends up living quietly in academic monographs and museum catalog notes, while the loud, oversimplified version dominates online discussion, and the actual tablet, sitting in a case in London, gets walked past by most visitors who have no idea what it says, what it adds up to. Strip away the sensational framing and what remains is still remarkable enough on its own. A civilization writing in clay more than 4,000 years ago recorded a story of a righteous man, a divine warning, a boat built to exact specifications, and a flood that ended one world and began another. That story did not disappear. It traveled through Akkadian scribes, through the library of an Assyrian king, through Babylon during the very period the Hebrew people were exiled there, and it resurfaced, reshaped, and retheologized, in a text that would go on to become one of the most widely read documents in human history. The Ark Tablet does not prove the flood happened exactly as described in either version. What it proves, sitting quietly in that British Museum case with its careful cuneiform grid of measurements for rope and reed and bitumen, is that this story mattered enormously to the people who first wrote it down, more than 1,000 years before anyone in ancient Israel put reed pen to parchment and began telling it their own way. So here is the question worth sitting with. If the flood story existed in written form 1,000 years before Genesis, carried across a dozen civilizations and reshaped by each one, does that make the biblical version less original? Or does it mean Genesis was doing exactly what every culture in that region had always done with this story? Taking something ancient and universal and making it their own? Tell me what you think in the comments, because the answer probably says as much about how you think stories become sacred as it does about archaeology. And if tablets like this one, sitting quietly in museum drawers for decades before anyone realized what they were holding, are the kind of history you want more of, subscribe, because there is a lot more buried out there still waiting to be read.